Ngā mate o te rā ui e tae ki e, haku koe ke o Ngāti Whakaue i hoake, pūmanawa e waru o te aroa kia ora. Kia rongo anō ngā manu tiori me ngā nutu kāka o te aroa rohe ki te matatini ki ngā ana wai, e mihi ana ai ki te kōrero. He uri hoki i iti o tērā kapahako Ngāti Whakaue, nā Ngāti Whiti Kaupeka. Nā reira tēnā koutou katoa. Malcolm Short, Ray Morihana, David Thomas, koutou te pai pūte o Ngāti Whakaue. Koinei te raudo iti a haere mihi ana, Wayne Knox, me ngā mātanga o te matapihi ngā mihi manahau. Being the understudy of James Brown helping Ngāi Taiki Tāmaki build communities was excellent preparation for Beltway politics. Iwi organisations are a superb training ground for parliamentary life. The diversionary tactics, the personalities, the unpredictability, the illogic and the humility required. But I wanted to pay special mention to my whanaunga, my kūrai whanaunga Jamie, Hemi, Leana Wharehoka, kei aku upoko tātara kihi for the Taranaki Maunga Settlement a Popo, tēnā koutou. Big shout out also to Pikiao, another Judge Tahana on the way, Annette Sykes told me there's something in the water at Tapuai Haruru. My kōrero today is about spending on public housing. We need to spend with purpose, simplify access to funding for suitable organisations including CHIPS and iwi. We need housing across the spectrum, especially affordable rentals, and to remove the funding maze. National expects funding to be straightforward. You should not have to win the Krypton factor or be Deputy Commissioner Wallace Homaha to work this out. We want people in decent homes, building strong whānau. I actually heard about this hui through my beautiful wife, Ariana Paul, who was scheduled to appear here as the manukura of Amutai. She has now returned for the third time to Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. Can't get enough. I was looking forward to hearing from her for the 18th time this week, and I'm sure you'd rather see her on stage than me. As many of you know, she's got empathy, wisdom and beauty. It must be that tūwhare toa maniapoto rauka wa whakapapa, Gina Rangi. Anyway, I wanted to acknowledge Minister Woods, Jackson and Davidson, and our ringatu minata Rawiri Waititi me tana tuarua Tāmati for your presence. Matua Willie, he's walked out already. I heard the procurement announcement the other day. In my view, non-central government organisations like Amutai are more suitable to spearhead procurement objectives rather than TPK or IMBI funding one another and their consultant mates. However, I digress. Housing significantly impacts nearly every aspect of New Zealand society: homelessness, equality, poverty, productivity, and all the other illities that you know. MSD admitted last week that the way people will continue to be placed along Fenton Street and surrounds over the last 5 years has led to a number of consequences. Unintended, mostly foreseeable. Surprise, surprise, crime and intimidatory behaviour. Not a surprise to me or anyone with an interest in Rotorua or the people in Ulster Street in Hamilton West, where there are up to 600 to 800 kids in emergency housing right now in Hamilton West and Hamilton. There are various factors contributing to our housing challenges, especially land supply. In addition, tax arrangements and until recently global interest rates, construction costs and population have all hindered affordable housing. I get the wairua wobbles when people tell me that building a Homestar 6 equivalent house costs $5,000 per square metre for the build cost, although I do hear that Willie Te Aho is doing it for $2,500 including just. But that could be down to the efficiency he achieves in Gizzy when you have Waikato expertise alongside you. Kia ora whaia, Linda Te Aho. Now, Kirihi Pihopa, also known as Chris Bishop, is National Spokesperson for Housing Infrastructure, Urban Development and RMA and sends his apology. He is the maverick and I'm the tamahehe rooster. I'm the Associate Housing, Māori Development Spokesperson for the National Party, and in my role I focus on social and emergency housing. Now, if you have real concerns and complaints with KO and MHUD, send me an email. I'm happily receive those. Thank you. National is absolutely focused on making sure we get the housing framework right. This reinforces our values around strong whānau, caring communities, equality of opportunity, and limited government. The right to an adequate standard of housing is set out in various international human rights documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is not surprising then to me to see all of you here today, not because of the rights documents, but because you have an absolute desire to serve and tautoko your communities, many of whom are in a housing crisis. Ngā mihi mata kui ki koutou. Our approach, New Zealand's approach to housing, and particularly Māori housing, has been suboptimal for decades. The government's role is potentially confused. Public housing is a cost, but are taxpayers getting the outcomes they deserve? Government cannot and despite what the Labour ministers say, are not the answer to everything. But it can support areas of housing need on a timely basis, like funding for housing demand and support for housing supply. We will not plan for whānau to be in state-owned housing for life or on an intergenerational basis. We just won't do that. We will support, but we won't plan for people to be in state housing for life. To the private sector, housing's a business. It's a revenue-generating exercise. If you don't make money, you go out of business. For the government, public housing is effectively a cost centre. You can nearly keep spending money and still be in the business of taxing people to build houses and look after people. But prudence is important, and we will take care not to end up in Al Bundy politics, giving money without outcomes. We just won't do that. For the taxpayer then, the long-term costs of housing spreads across assets, land, houses, infrastructure, and people, their health, their well-being, law and order. We have motivation to support adequate housing by way of frameworks and provision where suitable, and a core financial responsibility to ensure prudence in the use of taxpayers' money. Where we spend needs to count. Outcomes matter, and you're seeing this play out especially in health outcomes. Whānau, your money is not for government to tax and spend at will. As a result, monitoring and accountability for any public housing outcomes, including Māori housing outcomes, is critical, and it will be clinical, but with heart and manawa under national. As you know, New Zealand has some of the least affordable housing in the developed world, whether we are measuring by price to income ratio or other measure. Whilst prices for market housing have recently come down a little in most locations, partly as a function of the soaring inflation and interest rates, market housing is still out of reach for most whānau because of cost. A mere quarter of Māori own our own home, while 40% of non-Māori own their own home. The dream of home ownership is slipping for many unless we deliver outcomes more effectively. One concerning reality, which Shamabeel will know about, is the real credit to support builders and ultimately homeowners is drying up very quickly. We have the biggest credit slowdown since the GFC, and reliable sources tell me that a few builders are struggling to get finance for their own home builds, let alone their developments. That is a worry. But well-positioned organisations will find opportunities as this creeps across New Zealand, and I watch with interest how Helmut Modlik and other well-positioned organisations like Ngāti Toa swivel decisively over the next 12 to 18 months. Separately, some commentators suggest there are 300,000 whānau living in inadequate housing in God's own. You and I could guesstimate more than a third of these families are whānau Māori. I'm sure everyone in this room knows people living in poor housing. Look, my mother and father did for years, 40 years, and despite my suggestions, they would never buy a heat pump. Some parents and grandparents do hard really well, but really sadly. Whilst there have been some small housing wins, we know that we have collectively failed to enable and provide enough adequate housing and amenity for our growing and ageing population. We've also failed to look after all the assets and all the people that need to be housed in public housing in a manner that it genuinely reduces exposures to them, increases their mana and enhances their mana and taxpayers over time. That public housing is nearly 80,000 homes made up mainly of social housing, with many of them requiring replacement, and we still have a waiting list of 24,000 whānau. That is mind-blowing. E oku rangatira, rua nuku ruahine, I appreciate the mahi that each and every one of you do here to tautoko these whānau Māori to access adequate housing and create homes, some through repairs like Kāu Ora, some through papakainga housing like Te Aute College Old Boy, Zach Makware, leading the charge in Te Hauke. I always have to say Te Aute somewhere in my speeches. And others through wily leveraging of commercial arrangements and facilitating iwi ownership of market housing and occupation of public housing, and the same development like Waikato Tainu with Te Kārearea and Kirikiriroa. But some of these moving numbers are just worthwhile canvassing quickly. Rents since 2017 up on average $175 per week, helping the government make the cost of living crisis harder. The social housing waitlist numbers going from 5K to 24K whānau who can't access housing, create homes, support their whānau. Worse still, that was prior to the recent floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. The number not on the list, ko Waikahua, ko Waikatohu. People with the highest need, 820 waitlist, are waiting on average 421 days for a state home. That's a long time to wait. That Kiwi dream slipping away, turning into a nightmare. And about 14,000 of the lead applicants on that waitlist are Māori, so I'm assuming 3 per whānau, 40,000 Māori waiting to get into public housing. 3/4 in Northland, Auckland, Waikato Bay, plenty in the East Coast. $750 million may be underdone. There are now 3,000 Kiwi whānau in emergency housing, and we're spending $1 million a day on motels and hotels in places like Hamilton West. Like you, I'm really concerned. No amenities, no facilities, no hope. And Ulster Street and Hamilton West, like Fenton Street, is now a racing track for pack and save trolleys outside emergency hotels. This is one area where government failure to deliver must stop and government success in delivery must start. The number will explode more if we don't get on the tools faster. And finally, $4 billion a year just on helping emergency and rentals through accommodation supplement and the IRR. The question that I have to answer for myself is, what is government's role in public housing? It's to ensure those who need get a decent start or restart to, 1, build their home, and 2, build stronger whānau to help them get back to independence. We are mindful of the long-term costs of government support in housing, and we won't sit back and see so many people slipping into state dependence and socialist intervention for their entire lives. We won't do it. We will act. But houses, the actual asset, they're agnostic as to who lives in them. The intersection of how we build and look after the housing-related assets and how we look after people using those assets is the critical nexus for the government's role in public housing. It's not just the fancy infrastructure and going down to ITM and placemakers and getting, it's actually looking after the people. That's where there's a lot of action. And we're really keen as the National Party to work with people who want to bring that public housing register down, the waitlist down, and eliminate any permanency in homelessness, emergency and social housing. Now let's face it, no one except my daughter and maybe John Tamahere on Awerangi's advice knows everything. Some things have worked over the past few years in government provision around housing, but some have not. Kiwi Build did not work. The aspiration of 100,000 affordable sellers was glorious, but delivery was terrible, and anyone who concludes otherwise probably believes in the Easter Bunny. Land for housing, whereby funding provided has to be recycled in due course, this has actually worked okay. And under the previous national government, under people like Nick Smith, that really encouraged iwi investment in housing through Land for Housing in Tāmaki Makaurau. It worked, it works in some places, but not all, and it really depends on an appreciating land value and competence to deliver a product at a certain cost for takeout, whether it's public, private, or a mix of both. Ditto infrastructure like the $50 million COVID response infrastructure fund, not dissimilar from the Land for Housing arrangements, that was a goer and could be given more bandwidth under an incoming national government. UDA, STB arrangements, I can't even recall if there is one 3 years later. And I've met some great people in Kāinga Ora, but my overarching impression is that the breadth of the mandate and product mix they're expected to deliver is too wide. The organisation thinly spread and there are funding challenges. I'm surprised at times when Kāinga Ora gets involved in competing in land purchases, especially with iwi and Māori organisations. They're competing for the same piece of land, driving the price up towards Ranginui, crunching affordability when the keys are handed over. Kararaina Ben Ma, ngā mihi mata kōkō i o mahi whakaharahara ki MHUD. Te tuapapa kura kāinga. Now, Kirihi Pihopa, Chris Bishop recently commented on some national ideas to resolve this crisis. Free up land supply with more competitive markets, ensure infrastructure funding and financing so that infrastructure is not a barrier to new housing, help communities share in the benefits of housing growth, make resource consents cheaper and faster. I don't know if you've read the RMA and the other legislative changes proposed, but that's not convincing that it'll be easier to get a consent for a house and to get it built. Encourage a more competitive building markets, materials market. We need urgent reform on that, and I appreciate the work that the likes of Evergreen, Built Smart, Hector Egger and others are doing to maintain an accessible approach. And stop undermining mums and dads who are landlords and grandpas and grandmas. Interest deductibility for rental properties will be restored and the Bright Line test brought back to 2 years under national. There's been an extraordinary government commitment to support Māori housing, with Minister Henare announcing significant putea in the last year or two. And this mirrors your interest, your intense interest, to take action in the housing space. Now, some iwi and other investment arms have been doing this for years, like Ngāi Tahu, Waikato Tainui, Marutuahu. Recent interest is more around a mix, though, not just market, but market, public, affordable. But there's massively impressive activation of affordable housing outcomes, and I want to thank and acknowledge those with a whānau-centric approach. People like Marama and Ngārimu up at Ōrākei, Vicky, Carol and Tauranga Moana, Mana Newton and Mount Wellington. How Tauhara went to Mount Wellington, no one knows, but we'll figure that out everywhere later on. Ngāti Tahu and Ngāti Whao, they're everywhere. The National Party looks forward to the outcomes of the prototypes that have been supported, Kahungunu, Toitu Tara, Tairāwhiti, Kauru Ora and Te Pauahi, particularly with partners like BuiltSmart. And as they prove themselves out, we will tilt and lean and adapt as the National Party. My expectation is anyone involved in building public housing has a focus on delivering adequate housing for Aotearoa, for New Zealanders at scale, in a timely manner, that's suitable over time and doesn't fall apart in 20 or 30 years. We need homes that are built to last, resilient, well-designed, warm, dry and close to amenities. And I'm reminded of some of those derelict builds that went into GI or Glen Innes a few years ago. Shelley and Mihi Tibble know all about these, Shelley Kātai. The go-garn colours and the funky designs down on Apirana Ave. Everyone knew they weren't going to last, and they've been pushed over by TRC and friends. These were 20-year assets, but we need 50 to 80-year assets, and premiums should be considered for quality and durability. Iwi and Māori organisations are more involved in delivering housing. We're sustainable and competitive, and that could include iwi and Māori involvement across the value chain, as many of you are, supply of land either as freehold or leasehold, enabling flexible tenure, supply of goods and services, builders and potentially owners, providers of pastoral care and manaakitanga for residents. 35% of the registered chips are iwi and Māori organisations, but only 15% of the total public homes being managed by chips are those iwi and Māori organisations. I would like to see that number grow, and a lot more of our whānau who are in the social housing right now, and National will back those organisations who do a great job in this space. National considers the government's role to be less involved in offering a kaleidoscope of products and funding streams, and more geared towards creating the framework for simple access to funding for measurable outcomes. Government should devolve more where suitable across the entire housing spectrum and not seek to dominate the spectrum. It starts with land and infrastructure, spreads to buildings, but most importantly, the people and looking after the people. Good chips will be supported a lot more by National. But Matua James Brown, who I worked for a few years, instilled in me that everyone needs to have a drink. A fair agreed margin for building assets will continue, albeit we recognise the best risk-adjusted return in housing is actually through the rezoning phase rather than at the build phase. The easiest way to make money in housing is to go and buy a farm next to a city that's expanding and wait for someone to rezone it for you. Building public housing to be sustainable and enduring from a liability perspective or a long-term bang for buck is fundamental. That cannot primarily be a margin game. It is a cost to the taxpayers to do this, but that cost needs to provide measurable outcomes for everyone. For us to generally progress Māori housing for Māori at scale, there will need to be a greater focus on pastoral care manaakitanga for people living in homes and houses. I will work hard to understand, to listen to you, to see what's going on, to see where people do pastoral care manaakitanga very well, because that contributes to the health and well-being of the people, not just the house, but the care that goes with the house over time. And I'm aware that some iwi and Māori organisations already have a demonstrable record helping Māori and actually all New Zealanders. Our approach means the absolute focus will be on people having the ability to access a decent home and to diligently oversee taxpayer costs for creating the asset, managing the asset, and also means that an absolute dynamic mix of provision and pastoral care or manaakitanga will be supported. Co-design, devolution and delivery, I'm not allowed to talk about co-governance, co-design, devolution and delivery is the game. Just like when National funded the first matatini with Duncan McIntyre, the Kohanga Kura movement, the treaty settlement process and whānau ora. Thank you again for your time. I wanted to give you some brief insights, outline some initial ideas, and give you a sense of our direction of travel as we hear about and see some very good mahi that you are individually and collectively undertaking. Clarifying the role of government and housing is critical, and there'll be more to come from National. E te tia, te tā, te nui, e te rahi, o Ngāti Whakaue, puta atu ki ngā pumanawa e waru, ne rea ha koutou mā, ngā koeke, tēnā koutou katoa.